Yes, my name is Maciej Olchawa. I'm the author of an upcoming book. It'll be out in July of this year. It's called Mission Ukraine, the 2012-2013 diplomatic effort to secure ties with Europe. My book about the former president of Poland, Alexander Kwaśniewski, and his mission to Ukraine can be considered a sequel to my second book, which was called Stars and Trident, which discussed the relations between the European Union and Ukraine. It was published shortly before the Vilnius summit in November 2013. At that time, Ukraine was supposed to sign the association agreement, but as you know, it didn't. It would spark the protests and the Euromaidan. I was a policy advisor working in the European Parliament in Brussels at the time, so I followed closely the mission of President Kwaśniewski and Pat Cox, the former president of the European Parliament. By analyzing the process of Ukraine's European integration through the idea and work of Alexander Kwaśniewski, one of the, probably the greatest expert on Ukraine among European statesmen, I try to offer insight into the complexities of Ukraine today and during that time, and also to the intricacies of the EU diplomacy. So in the course of a year and a half, Alexander Kwaśniewski and Pat Cox had traveled to Ukraine 27 times, spending a total of 80 days working there, trying to secure the signing of the association agreement between Ukraine and the EU. One of the greatest obstacle was that Yulia Tymoshenko, the former prime minister, was imprisoned. So from 2011, relations between the EU, relations between Kiev and Brussels were pretty much frozen. Now, the president of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, came up with he proposed the idea of sending special envoys to Ukraine to make sure that Ukraine can overcome those obstacles, i.e. selective justice, so it could sign the association agreement and the DCFTA, which was the integral part of that agreement. That was the deep and comprehensive free trade area. So Alexander Kwaśniewski and Pat Cox were chosen as the special envoys. So my book is a case study about that. It is about the mission and its effort to secure a European path for Ukraine. It displays the intricate game of chicken, as I like to call it, the political and diplomatic game of chicken played between Viktor Yanukovych and the EU. So in the last moment, it was actually Viktor Yanukovych that swerved at the last second. It wasn't the EU. Up until the very end, the EU said, we want to integrate Ukraine, we want to sign the association agreement, but it was Viktor Yanukovych that backed out of it. So, as you know, that sparked the protests in the Euromaidan, which then transformed into protests and demonstrations and civil unrest against corruption, against the regime, against their use of power, and so on. But it was sparked by the Ukrainians' dream to have a future that was deeply integrated with the European Union. The moment that Yanukovych hijacked that dream and those European ambitions, people took to the streets. So we know these events as they unfolded and what happened after. This is how it all began, and about a mission and the EU's last all-out effort to keep those European dreams alive in the Ukrainians' hearts. Yes. He met with Yanukovych on numerous occasions, hours and hours. So he was dealing directly with Prime Minister Azarov too, and the regime took this mission very seriously. So they set up a whole group of individuals and prosecutors allowed them to have documents in terms of the court proceedings. They were allowed to go into the hospital or the prison cell that was inside of a hospital for Yulia Tymoshenko. The government took measures that were very extensive in terms of allowing the EU envoys to get access to everything. So that's why everybody believed that Yanukovych sincerely wanted to sign the association agreement, that he was opting for the European option. Whether he was sincere or not at the time is a matter that I discuss in the book, and I incorporate the commentary of Alexander Kwaśniewski, who had met him for hours and hours. And there's a lot of anecdotes on their meetings, a lot of things that Yanukovych said to Kwaśniewski. At one point, Yanukovych desperately wanted to explain, where he got his money from. Obviously, he was not from a very well-off family. He spent time in prison, so he just came up with these stories. That at one time he told Kwaśniewski that he was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, that he was a test driver for BMW in Munich, for example. Another time he said, well, then Kwaśniewski responded, well, then you must know German. And he kind of just, he changed the subject. Then he also told him that he played poker, right when the Soviet Union collapsed, and he made a lot of money that way. So, but Kwaśniewski said that each time his story changed, and that in order to, for these stories to stick, you have to be a good liar and have a good memory, and Yanukovych did not have a good memory, so Kwaśniewski saw right through them. The book is filled with personal stories like that where Kwaśniewski did, and Pat Cox did meet with Yanukovych. I mean, Pat Cox also, from the sources that I interviewed, they said he had notepads, about a dozen notepads at the end of this mission with notes that he took, so that every time, when the prosecutor said something, he would just refer back to them and say, no, that's not what you said. So he also obviously met with Yanukovych a lot of times, and it was a culture shock for him at the things that were happening and things that were being said and sometimes screamed in the court proceedings during the Tymoshenko trials. So, so it was probably quite an experience for both of them, to spend so much time with Yanukovych. And that was the bone of contention during all this. It was making sure that she had proper treatment and that she could go to get treated in Germany. Now, the association agreement and the ability to sign it was basically put on hold because a former prime minister, a leader of the largest opposition party, was in jail. And everybody knew that it was politically motivated and that selective justice of the Party of Regions was being implemented. Now, the reason that Kwaśniewski and Cox were able to, it's been said that the mission failed in that they did not get her out of jail. But I argue that they kept her safe because there was so much media attention when they went there. They almost to the very end, they almost did. They were almost successful in attaining her release. Now, the reason why that was a precondition was that Tymoshenko had obviously great contacts within Brussels itself, and the European People's Party, to which Batyrshina belongs to. They lobbied heavily. And also the former members of that government lobbied heavily in Brussels to make sure that her release was a precondition to the signing of the association agreement. So Martin Schulz, who was a socialist, he was president of the European Parliament at the time. He wanted this special envoy mission to take care of her release. Now, Kwaśniewski convinced him for it to encompass more things. While we're there, let's get more things done. So that was judicial and legal reforms. So not only was it trying to secure her release or her treatment in Germany, which de facto was her release, but also judicial and legal reforms. Now, there were also two other instances or one very important situation where they did achieve their goals, which was Yuri Lutsenko and his release, securing his release. Now, that set a precedent that Kwaśniewski and Cox later referred to in terms of Tymoshenko. Now Yanukovych did not want to release her. The reason why he did not want to release her was first, as Kwaśniewski puts it, revenge. He hated her. That was clear from the beginning. And two, he didn't want a political opponent who had a political party that had structures in all of Ukraine that was able to be a real, that was a rival to him, to be out of jail. Now this sheds light on just a different mentality of Ukrainian politics. Now, Kwasniewski commented that in Western democracies, somebody like Tymoshenko, who's not an angel, and depending on whether her the deal that she made with the Russian, the so-called gas deal, whether it was good or bad, she should have paid a political price for that. So voters should decide whether she would be in power again or not, if that was such a bad deal. Now, she went to jail for that. That wouldn't happen, and that wouldn't happen in the West. And even for political calculations, Kwasniewski said, it would just pay to have, politically speaking, your political rival should be. It would be far better to keep them out of prison and just let public opinion judge them on the moves that they made, and not put them in jail. But in Yanukovych's kind of Donbass gangster criminal mentality, you just have to take care of your opponents and any challenge that might arise with them. So that was one thing. Now the notion of a nation of 50 million people that want to integrate with the European Union on the precondition of releasing one individual from jail. Now, that is a matter that I discuss in the book, whether that precondition was a smart move by the European Union. Now, ultimately, Tymoshenko solved that problem for the European Union and for Ukraine itself, because she said, regardless of whether Yanukovych lets me out of jail or not, I urge the Ukrainian side and the European Union side to sign the association agreement during the Eastern Partnership Summit in November 2013. So Tymoshenko solved the Tymoshenko problem. Now, Kwasniewski and Cox, she would not want to ask for a pardon, because asking a pardon of Yanukovych, which she thought was a criminal, would be admitting to her guilt. So ultimately, and this is just hours of negotiations. Like I said, they went to Ukraine 27 times, 80 working or more than 80 days working in Ukraine itself, something along 150 working days, because they were obviously going to Strasbourg and Brussels and other European countries, or European capitals, Berlin included, and even in Washington D.C., where Kwasniewski went to different places where he explained Ukraine and explained the situation at hand. So hours and hours of negotiations, trying to convince Tymoshenko, to ask for a pardon. When she finally wrote a letter to Yanukovych, it was full of insults. So Kwasniewski said it would have been better off if she hadn't wrote it in the first place. But finally, they were the ones that asked for that pardon, and Tymoshenko accepted that. Now the pardon was supposed to be given by the Verkhovna Rada in terms of adjusting some certain laws so that she could get treatment, so that she could acquire treatment in Berlin, in Germany, outside of Ukraine. Now that didn't happen because the Party of Regions, which was obviously following Yanukovych's orders, stalled in passing that resolution prior to the Vilnius summit in Lithuania in November 2013. The mission was very subtle, and Kwasniewski and Cox, right from the beginning, they did not offer any commentary. When they would leave the prison, the hospital, when they would leave the office of the Prime Minister of Azarov, or whether they were talking to Yanukovych, they did not want, and they agreed upon this, to give updates or commentary to the media. Now, the reason they didn't want to do that is because they didn't want their words to be twisted, and there wasn't enough time. Obviously, they were rushing from plane to plane, place to place to get to all these meetings, so they didn't want to give too much commentary. They were asked numerous times, "How is Tymoshenko feeling?" Everybody wanted to know about her, her physical, her health, her state of health. They didn't comment on that, and they did it for that purpose of not having their words manipulated, because they didn't have enough time to. Kwasniewski said they didn't have enough time to respond to that. Plus, they were preparing a report on that the whole time. That was their mission. I mean, their mission was given by the European Parliament, and it was extended numerous times. So each time something happened in the developments, they would go back to meet with the Conference of Presidents, which in the European Parliament is made up of all the leaders of the political groups. whether it's the Christian Democrats, the Socialists, the Greens, the Liberals, Conservatives, they were meeting with the Conference of Presidents, and they were in these closed meetings, they were saying what the state of play in these negotiations was. So they couldn't reveal too much to the media. So your question on whether what could have been known, well, at the time it was very delicate. They were, I mean, their official function was to keep an open line of communication between the Ukrainian government and the EU. So they had to be very subtle in what they were able to tell the media. That's why the report, certain preliminary reports were released, but the final report, which would make those recommendations, whether can the EU sign the association agreement, that was obviously prolonged, and they were even criticized for stalling sometimes. The reason why there was such a culture shock in terms of Pat Cox and his understanding of that part of the world is because these people often not only did they bluff very often, but they were just outright liars. Now Kwasniewski has a long history in dealing with the East and dealing with Russia and dealing with Ukraine. He's been dealing with Ukraine for over 20 years. So he knows Russian. He's able to communicate. He understands Ukrainians and the mentality of these politicians. And I think he's able to play good cop, bad cop. And because he understands, their mentality, their background, and how to deal with them. So I think at moments he was very tough with them. A lot of that is in the book in terms of how he spoke to Yefremov, for example, or Rybak in the Verkhovna Rada and those negotiations. So yes, there is a psychological element to dealing with the Yanukovych regime and Yanukovych himself, and I think Kwasniewski was very good at that. I think right now we have the Anschluss of Crimea, we have the war, the Russian war, and the Kremlin-sponsored terrorists in eastern Ukraine. Thousands of people have died. The Nebesna Sotnya in the Euromaidan, these people sacrificed for those European values, and that was the spark. So what I would like readers to get from this book is to see the whole chain of events that led to that spark. Having the privilege of working in the European Parliament, being in Brussels at this time, that's what I focused on. I focused on the Cox-Kwasniewski mission, but having to write the kind of backdrop, the canvas of Kwasniewski's dealings with Ukraine and his mission in Ukraine, I had to do research more on the Orange Revolution. So I looked at the period of 2004, 2005, where Kwasniewski actually brokered helped negotiate a peaceful solution to the contested presidential elections between Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. So that was something that I had to do a lot more research on because it was a period where I was still in college, so I was still an undergrad at that time. So I had to look into how the Orange Revolution, or what I found out traveling to Ukraine, Ukrainians prefer to call it the so-called Orange Revolution, how that played into the Euromaidan and Kwasniewski's experience and his ability to be part of the special and the European Parliament Special Envoy mission. Now the reason, and this is what I go into in the book, that both sides trusted Kwasniewski was because of that role that he played during the Orange Revolution. I mean, there were instances where, obviously he had his sympathies with Yushchenko and the Orange Camp. Obviously, that's the path that he wanted Ukraine to go toward in terms of the West and Europe and the Euro-Atlantic integration. But as president of Poland, he strictly abided by the rule of being a moderator. Now, when Yushchenko wanted him to go on the Maidan, wear an orange scarf, and when the crowds were cheering Polsha, Polsha, Kwasniewski kind of stayed in the background, and he wanted to retain that role of a mediator to the very end. So he didn't want it to be obvious that he was picking a side. So that allowed, the Party of Regions to agree to Kwasniewski being part of the mission in 2012. So you can see that he had that, he's very farsighted in terms of knowing that he has to speak to both sides. He has to keep that line of communication open. He's able to, and he's been able to do that very effectively, because the people that were initially was supposed to be one special envoy, but in order to keep that balance in terms of, and this is the intricacies of European of EU diplomacy in the European Parliament, is that there's geographic and political balance, and that balance was kept in the person of Pat Cox, who was a liberal from Ireland. His party belonged to the European People's Party, the EPP, and then Kwaśniewski, a former president, Poland, and always more associated with the left political parties. So there was that political and geographic balance that was kept in terms of those two individuals being the special envoys, and that's something that both the political groups in the European Parliament agreed to, and the Azarov agreed to also, because there were negotiations between Azarov and Schulz on how this special envoy mission would look like. So I think then that's what I begin the book with. Not only what Kwaśniewski believes the role of the European Union should be, and what added value Ukraine adds to it. Why should the EU care about Ukraine in the first place? But also his experience in the Orange Revolution as the president of Poland. I think it's years of experience, and that maturity which you referred to in terms of being able to deal with a thug like Yanukovych. I think that's years of experience of knowing that, and this is what Kwaśniewski does, what Alexander Kwaśniewski does very well. He says, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative to not, keeping that line of communication open? I mean, was it sanctions? Ukraine would be another Belarus. We just turn our back to it. So I think that his ability to keep that dialogue open and, to speak to everybody, as president of Poland, he fostered relations with Kuchma, even after the, Kochuga Gate affair, when everybody in the United States was furious, in terms of the anti-radar system that was potentially that Ukraine potentially sold to Iraq at that time. So, during the, for example, the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council in 2002, nobody wanted to sit next to Kuchma. The problem with that was that, this meeting in Prague, the problem with that was that seats were divided alphabetically, and the United States would sit next to Ukraine. So in a very not so delicate and kind of undiplomatic gesture, the name tags were distributed in French. So that way President Bush wouldn't have to sit next to Kuchma. Now, Kwaśniewski didn't believe that kind of treatment was productive. So he kept the line of communication with Kuchma open. And obviously you could see how that allowed him to play a constructive role in 2004 when Kuchma called him. Kuchma did exactly that. He called him and said, well, there's this situation here. The presidential elections are contested. People are protesting. And obviously Kuchma didn't want to leave his legacy as some sort of bloodbath in the streets of Kiev on the Maidan. So who did he call? He called Kwaśniewski. And Kwaśniewski came in and along with Javier Solana, and who was the High Representative for Common Security and Defense Policy of the European Union at the time, and Valdas Adamkus, the president of Lithuania, they came in and created a round table and negotiated a peaceful settlement to that. So I think it's that ability to always want to talk and be diplomatic and keep that line of communication open. I think that allowed him, to play a very positive role in the Orange Revolution and potentially save people from being killed, because that could have happened in 2004, 2005. And then that allowed him to play a very positive role in the European Parliament's mission, and the Cox-Kwaśniewski mission. So, and I think his Alexander Kwaśniewski mission is not over yet. I think he'll have a lot to still do more with Ukraine, because there's still a lot to be done, and he has that experience, that authority, that legitimacy, where people trust him. I think one of the most interesting analysis that I'm able to provide in the book, which I wrote following my interviews with Alexander Kwaśniewski, was that Yanukovych could have easily predicted. I mean, he wasn't the most intellectual figure in Europe, but he could have predicted that, well, if I don't sign the association agreement, there'll be protests in the street. I mean, and he could have avoided them very easily. When Kwaśniewski said all he could have done was just get construction, trucks onto Khreshchatyk and just block the Euromaidan so protesters couldn't come out. Think of something, I don't know, some construction, just block that whole area. So that was easy to predict. Now, the fact that he didn't predict that or didn't think about that, according to Kwaśniewski, is, well, he maybe didn't have that kind of intellectual capacity, to think strategically like that. But Putin, he obviously had to take that under consideration, that people would protest first about, his U-turn in terms of European integration, and then that those protests would turn into demonstration against the corrupt nature of the regime, against the status quo, and so on and so on. So the question that Kwaśniewski asks and is why didn't Putin foresee that would happen? Well, the answer is two. There are two answers to that. That one, he doesn't understand Ukraine, and that's Kwaśniewski doesn't believe that. That doesn't seem very it's not a plausible argument. And two is that he wanted those demonstrations to take place and chaos to take place, because that way he could order or tell Yanukovych to use force, and the more the more chaos there would be in Ukraine, the further he would be able to pursue his interests and block Ukraine from integrating with the European Union. I think let me rephrase that. I think Putin has a clear strategy toward Ukraine, and he understood the Yanukovych regime. He had contact with them constantly, and he was allowed. He was able to put a lot of pressure on them, possibly even blackmail Yanukovych into not signing the association agreement. Now, the point where I agree with Professor Motul and other commentators is that Putin doesn't understand, or he doesn't appreciate, the national identity and the dreams of the Ukrainian nation. He doesn't understand. He doesn't understand how far they're willing to go, to be free and to be able to pick their own future, and in this instance, a European future. So I think he comprehends, that he understood the political situation at the time, and he played his cards very well. But on the other hand, he didn't appreciate the fact that people would protest for so long, that they would be willing to die for their European dream, and that Ukraine is so determined to be an independent nation. Thank you, William. I appreciate it. And this was a wonderful opportunity. It was a pleasure speaking with you, and I really admire what you're doing. So, thank you. I've been following your videos very closely, especially with Alexander Motul. He inspired me to learn about Ukraine. So thanks a lot. It was a pleasure meeting you. Please stay in touch. Thank you.